In Bangladesh, workers are paid about 33 cents per hour, while the average wage in sweatshops in India is barely 58 cents. And yet, the value of the corporations that are benefiting from this labor is hundreds of billions of dollars. Fast fashion is slow violence, and modern-day sweatshops specifically are violence perpetrated by the descendants of colonizers against the descendants of the colonized. Hey y'all, it's Sarah Maria. Welcome back to my channel where we break down the problem of consumerism and its intersection with other systems of oppression, taking a deep dive into how we can be more conscious consumers and people in general. When we think about fast fashion, we see stores full of mannequins styled head to toe in the latest trends. We see the racks lined with multiple different styles of denim jeans. Do you want the mom jean, the boyfriend jean, wide leg, straight leg, skinny jean, cargo jean? So many options. We can even shop from the comfort of our bed and see the more than 1,000 styles of coats alone. Looking for dresses? They've got over 7,000 styles of them. And did I mention new styles are added every day? Even when we're not shopping, we're still shopping, thanks to almost every aspect of our life turning into a living, breathing billboard. When we think about fast fashion, we see the glitz and glamour of the end product sealed in a pretty pink bag. What we don't see is everything else. We don't see the bodies that toiled away for hours and hours to create these pretty shirts only to receive less than a livable wage as a reward for their hard labor. We don't see the migrant workers funneled into the luxury handbag production industry who work short-term contracts under arduous conditions operating dangerous machinery only to not receive payment at the end of their contract. We don't see the massive amounts of oil and cotton extracted from the earth every second just to be turned into one of the millions of garments filling stores to maybe get sold to someone who didn't even need it in the first place. Or it will just sit there, look pretty, and gather dust until eventually it gets thrown away to be one of the millions and millions of garments that fills landfills. In this video, we'll be exploring the dark side of fast fashion and its roots in oppressive colonialism and slavery, the ways in which the modern clothing industry feeds off of what was left behind from the previous exploitation of land and people in order to continue that exploitation for their own benefit. AKA, we're exploring why the global south is producing all of these clothes under exploitative conditions, clothes which the global north receives and uses to adorn their bodies and fill their stores for vanity and ostentatious display, and then eventually discards as trash, sending it back to the land which produced it so it can rot and decay in mile-high piles. This is the legacy of colonialism in fast fashion. Let's get into it. So in order to understand what's going on today, it's important to have some historical context. Modern-day colonialism began with the age of exploration, starting in the 1400s, going all the way to the 1800s, when European empires began to set out on transatlantic voyages, seeking new lands, resources, and trade routes. It started with the Portuguese, who began exploring the Atlantic coast of Africa, seeking riches and resources. At the time, it was known that Africa was rich in gold and salt, and also had an established slave trading system, and it was known that this is what facilitated the wealth and power of the Mali Empire. Portugal was actually very poor at the time and sought to increase their own wealth and power through their navigation and connection to other lands. Lands which were full of natural resources and also full of people who could be sold into the European slave trade. And that's exactly what they did along the coast of Africa, setting up ports and slave trading stations that were integrated into the pre-existing slavery system that was established by African empires. Then it was the Spanish who followed suit, sponsoring the infamous Christopher Columbus, who in the late 1400s encountered what is today known as the Caribbean islands and eventually the Americas. The Spanish strategy was a bit different from the early Portuguese strategy because the Spanish sought to actually form colonies in which they, the empire, would control the land and all the people on it, as opposed to just establishing ports and trading routes. To quote this video, the colonization model used by Spain and eventually by the the rest of Europe's empires, was built on the idea that colonies existed for the benefit and enrichment of the colonizers, and secondarily, to convert human souls to Christianity. As the Spanish Empire began to colonize the Americas and the Caribbean islands, they brought disease, violence, and exploitation with them, as we all know. They wiped out entire populations of native people, and of the ones that survived, they were viewed as property to be sold, and ultimately to work the land and generate wealth for the empire that colonized them. Ultimately, all this exploration and colonization set the stage for unprecedented globalization. It established paths between different parts of the world that would go on to be used to transport goods, resources, people, and ideas. While it sounds like it could have been such a beautiful evolution of humanity, it brought with it so much injustice and violence. Unfortunately, this was a system that benefited a handful of people and caused devastating harm to millions. As we know, other European empires started to see what Spain was doing and began to set sail themselves in search of wealth, power, and access in this new age of globalization. In the 1600s, the British Empire colonized the northeastern coast of what is today known as the US. They came to North America looking for religious freedom and economic prosperity. Ironic that they came seeking their own religious freedom, but then were completely intolerant of the spiritual beliefs and just general existence of the native people whose land they were coming to. So in order for the British to be able to follow the colonization model of the Spanish, they needed a slightly different approach. And so came the invention of joint stock companies. Since the British, also the Dutch and the French, wanted to expand their empires like the Spanish and the Portuguese, but couldn't afford to finance the risky overseas expeditions, they needed access to diversified capital. Lots of it. They needed it to be diversified to minimize risk, and they needed lots of it, well, for financial power, obviously. They started forming joint stock companies, which allowed wealthy citizens/families to invest their own money into colonization missions, and promised that they would receive a profit, a return on their investment, based on the wealth that was obtained from these missions. This provided them the financial power that was needed to carry out colonization, and also gave them an urgent motivation to secure large profits. You know, gotta please the shareholders by any means. Created over a century before British colonization of North America, was the most notorious example of one such joint stock company. The English East India Company, founded in 1600, which inspired the formation of the Dutch East India Company just 2 years later. The formation of these companies had one purpose: to exploit and monopolize resources and trade across and through Asia. However, they far exceeded their initial plan, which was only about business, and began to be a de facto governing body over the entire swath of land that is modern-day India. Starting as a monopolistic trading body, the company became involved in politics and acted as an agent of British imperialism in India from the early 18th century to the mid-19th century. So essentially, this was a private corporation that monopolized trading in an entire country. But they also had their own army of about 200,000 soldiers, which was even more than the British Empire's army at the time. They used this army to oppress and massacre civilians when they attempted to rise up against the exploitative conditions. They also relied on slave labor and trafficked slaves from Africa, mostly from Mozambique and Madagascar. To put the cherry on top, as if we needed one, they also illegally sold opium to China, which China strongly opposed, and this is what started the Opium Wars of the 1800s. All for what? Wealth and power. The Dutch East India Company, after accounting for modern-day inflation, is the most valuable corporation of all time, worth approximately $8 trillion. To put that into perspective, Apple and Microsoft are worth just around $3 trillion each. The joint stock company system would go on to be duplicated many times. During North American colonization, it was called the Virginia Company of London, which didn't grow to become quite as powerful as the East India Companies, but still helped facilitate British colonization of North America. On the topic of colonization as a method for seeking economic prosperity, the British began to practice mercantilism, an economic system which focused on increasing a nation's wealth by maximizing exports and minimizing imports. For the British Empire, this meant that the empire's colonies could supply raw materials and resources to the mother country and subsequently be used as export markets for the finished products. So they would essentially carry out large-scale extraction of raw materials from the land they colonized, and then also use these colonies as the export markets to sell the finished products that were produced from these raw materials. In the 1660s, England passed the Acts of Trade and Navigation, also known as the Navigation Acts. They were a series of laws designed to make American colonies more dependent on manufactured products from Great Britain. In this vein, British authorities further enumerated a set of protected goods that could only be sold to British merchants, including sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, furs, and iron. They put tariffs on imports of foreign goods to ensure that colonists would purchase goods from England and not from other countries. Then they also passed laws such as the Stamp Act, Sugar Act, and the Townshend Acts, all of which put taxes on these goods that they were essentially forcing American colonists to purchase from England. This brought the British Empire great wealth, obviously, but it was a system built on unequal trade and exploitative labor, relying heavily on the enslavement and forced labor of both indigenous populations and Africans captured and brought to the colonies. Between 1492 and 1880, between 2 and 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved in the Americas, in addition to 12.5 million African slaves. Entire generations of human beings reduced to mere commodities and placed in cruel, violent circumstances, all so that the European empires could become more wealthy and powerful. While the concept of slavery did exist long before this time period, the era of European colonization established a large-scale system to commodify, sell, and trade human bodies, and this was called the Atlantic slave trade. West African slave traders would kidnap villagers, including children. They would be transported to the coasts, where slave forts were built to hold them until European and American slave traders came to load them onto ships and transport them across the Atlantic. I will never forget my visit to the Gambia in West Africa, where I went into an old slave fort that was used to hold kidnapped Africans waiting to be sold into the slave trade. There was a typical looking house in which the slave owners lived comfortably, but directly beneath that house was a small, dark, cramped room with cells and chains. I am just under 5 feet tall, and the ceiling of this room grazed my head. I remember them telling us that this room would be filled with people, potentially crammed in there for months. I saw the heavy metal chains that were used for what they called the strongest, most rebellious men. It is actually impossible to explain the visceral disgust and pain that I felt in my body from being in the space of such horror and violence. After being stored like inanimate objects, these people would be eventually loaded onto ships. To the slave traders, these human beings were cargo, and slave ships were especially designed to transport as many captives as possible, with little regard for either their health or their humanity. Slave decks were often only a few feet high, and the African captives were shackled together, lying down, side by side, head to foot, or even closer. Deaths from suffocation, malnutrition, and disease were routine on the slave deck, as were arbitrary torture and murder by the crew. The closeness, the filth, and the fear delivered many into madness. I'm sorry for such graphic imagery, but facing this violence is necessary in understanding the legacy of slavery and colonialism, and the role that corporations like joint stock companies played in it and continue to play in it. Today, some examples of the most wealthy and powerful joint stock companies include Amazon, Walmart, Apple, and Microsoft. While it may look a little different than the violence carried out by European imperialist corporations back in the day, these modern day corporations, including fast fashion corporations, are doing the exact same thing. Let me explain how. In order for a business to become a billion-dollar corporation, let alone a multi-billion-dollar corporation, there are many things it can decide to commodify and sell. Clothing, food, even things you would think couldn't get commodified, like health and knowledge. Of all the things they can decide to commodify and sell, or all the ways they decide to do it, there is one ingredient they will always need: exploitation.
Those familiar with Marxist literature will already know that exploitation is the expropriation of surplus value from labor by capital. For X amount of hours worked, workers will be paid Y amount of money. In order for that deal to be profitable for the owner class, they need to pay workers less money than the value they actually produce. That difference is what Marx calls surplus value. The money that you make for the company will always be more than the money the business puts back into your hands in the form of a paycheck. If you want an idea of just how much value business owners steal from their workers, just look at this Ohio pizza shop, where for one day the owner decided not to siphon off that surplus value and instead put it back into the hands of the workers. The result? Employees made $78 an hour. That's the Marxist definition of exploitation, and every single capitalist business in the world relies on it.
You want to understand how humans back then were capable of enslaving other humans and exploiting their bodies for nothing more than apparently some very valuable paper? You want to understand how humans back then were able to loot and plunder and wipe out entire civilizations for nothing more than an ego-based sense of false power? All you have to do is look at billionaire corporations today. Every billion-dollar clothing corporation is completely reliant on cheap labor. Labor that can more easily be exploited. Bodies that can more easily be wrung out, bled dry, discarded, and replaced. As a side note, I do want to note that my use of evocative graphic language is fully intentional. I think we have a tendency to censor history and its violence, but the censoring of history is selectively protective. It protects those who would feel uncomfortable at the thought of such violence, at the expense of those who need to be protected from history being replicated, those who need society to learn from its mistakes by facing its own violence. There seems to be a collective amnesia, a collective disconnect from our ability to relate to the feelings of other living things and our ability to humanize other populations of people. And I think that's largely due to the wedge that has been driven between different classes of society. The world that the rich live in is different from that which the poor live in. So different that the rich don't actually care what goes on in the world of the poor, so long as it doesn't affect them. But what I think they will soon come to realize is that we have always shared one planet. The bottom may burn first, but if you're feeling the heat, the fire is never too far away. As I was saying, and I've said this in a past video, the reason you're able to get so many clothes for so cheap is exploitation of labor. And the reason corporations like H&M and Shein are able to be worth billions of dollars is exploitation of labor. Channel 4's documentary Inside the Shein Machine sent undercover cameras to film factory workers who were forced to pull 17-hour shifts to make hundreds of garments a day. In one factory, they made a daily base salary of $20, which would then be docked by $14 if any garments had mistakes. And in recent years, H&M has been under fire for supplying from factories utilizing unregulated child labor in Myanmar, where workers were subject to 6 or 7 day work weeks without benefits, receiving less than a livable wage, and some instances of forced unpaid overtime. Clothing companies are constantly on the lookout for production locations that can make clothes quickly and at low costs. Over the past few years, Myanmar has rapidly become a popular sourcing destination for the garment industry due to a huge pool of cheap labor and favorable import and export tariffs. However, working conditions in this industry are far from acceptable. Labor rights violations are rife. Asian suppliers are setting up shop in Myanmar in an unseemly race to the bottom, pushed by foreign buyers that are eager to secure the cheapest possible prices. A good way of understanding how this is the legacy of colonialism is by using the term slow violence, coined by Rob Nixon, which refers to a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Fast fashion is slow violence. While we can and should differentiate between colonial era chattel slavery and modern day sweatshops, both are still violence. And modern day sweatshops specifically are violence perpetrated by the descendants of colonizers against the descendants of the colonized. Going back in time again for a little bit, the era of European colonization established the systematic dehumanization of Black and brown bodies that is used to justify oppression on the basis of race classifications. A letter from Reverend John Sargent outlining his plan for education of the natives says, "To raise them, if possible, into a civil and industrious people, by introducing the English language among them, and thereby instilling into their minds and hearts with a more lasting impression the principles of virtue and piety," implying that proximity to European values and lifestyles equals dignity, and that if natives did not assimilate, they would remain inferior beings. One Puritan minister believed that the illness and decimation of the New England Native Americans was an act of God to support the colonists' right to the land, referring to the spread of smallpox that came from Europe and wiped out entire populations of native people, and implying that this was a good thing because somehow Europeans deserved the land more than Native Americans deserved to be alive. When the transatlantic slave trade began in Africa in 1441, most Africans were placed in a new and different category of enslavable peoples, in terms that flowed from an understanding in the European worldview of Africans as inferior beings. Race-based ideas of European superiority and religious beliefs in the need to Christianize heathen peoples contributed to a culture in which enslavement of Africans could be rationalized and justified. Additionally, early settlers made references to the work of one African being equal to that of 4 to 8 natives. This way of thinking is what allowed Europeans for centuries, and honestly still to this day, to reference people of African descent as being not fully human, likening them to animals or beasts. Beings that were strong and more resistant to pain, and therefore they made ill-informed assumptions that people of African descent could withstand and even deserved greater levels of cruelty. Today, we continue to see this dehumanization and indignity drawn out. Companies have to find people that the world won't care about, that the world won't see as inherently valuable and dignified beings, and these are the people they can get away with exploiting for cheap labor. This is the basis of the use of prison labor here in the US. The 13th Amendment of the US Constitution prohibits slavery except as a punishment for crime, aka corporations are able to exploit prisoners for their labor because the law states that they are not protected from enslavement. So now corporations can work these people as much as they can and barely pay them anything, thereby making themselves richer. The Federal Bureau of Prisons says sentenced inmates are required to work if they are medically able. Institution work assignments include employment in areas like food service or the warehouse, or work as an inmate orderly, plumber, painter, or groundskeeper. Inmates earn 12 cents to 40 cents per hour for these work assignments. The fact that a government agency proudly boasts this fact on their website is appalling. You are openly telling everyone that you are forcing people to labor for literal pennies, 12 pennies an hour. It's no wonder why the US has such high rates of incarceration. They need to build more prisons and fill them with prisoners because that's how they can engage in modern day slavery and make more money. Thus, we have the prison industrial complex that builds corporate wealth from systematic dehumanization, disproportionate dehumanization of Black and brown bodies, might I add. Black people account for 13% of the US population, but 39% of the incarcerated population. White people make up 75% of the US population, but only 31% of the incarcerated population. Additionally, Native people are incarcerated at a rate of 763 per 100,000, which is 4 times higher than that of white people at 181 per 100,000. I hope you're seeing the thread here. Some companies are going to catch a stray, but really all companies should catch a stray. But McDonald's, Wendy's, Starbucks, and Walmart are a few of the corporations that have been found to have benefited in some way at some point from exploitative prison labor. but there's a lot more on that list. The fast fashion industry is notorious for the use of sweatshops, which are small manufacturing establishments that employ workers under unsafe and unfair working conditions. Sweatshop workers, often women and children, suffer grueling workdays and meager pay that does not cover basic expenses, while offering them cruel working and living circumstances. In several manufacturing nations, including Bangladesh, China, and India, the minimum wage only covers half to a fifth of what a family needs to make ends meet. In Bangladesh, workers are paid about 33 cents per hour, while the average wage in sweatshops in India is barely 58 cents. And yet, the value of the corporations that are benefiting from this labor is hundreds of billions of dollars. Inditex, Zara's parent company, reported its highest ever profits in 2023. Its net profit reached $5.9 billion that year alone. How are they so wealthy? Well, the same way the East India Company got so wealthy: exploitation of labor. While we may be hesitant to call what's going on in fast fashion sweatshops slavery because it's such a strongly evocative and aversive word, fast fashion's use of sweatshops is essentially capitalizing on bodies deemed less valuable and more disposable for the purposes of maximizing their wealth. Very close, if not identical, to the definition of slavery. Main difference being that today, humans that work in sweatshops are not technically being owned by someone else. However, I would say that just because you can't see the chains doesn't mean they're not there. The global inequality that exists in today's world means that economic opportunity is not as abundant in lower GDP countries as it is in higher GDP countries. Less opportunity means less freedom of choice. The reason why the large majority of garment workers are women in the global south is because they have fewer options to do other things in the society they live in. Being a woman alone creates less opportunity, less freedom of choice. Being a woman living in poverty, the options are even more diminished. Factory owners have taken advantage of women's unequal position in society to form an even cheaper, more docile and flexible workforce. So rather than challenging their subordination in society, work in the garment industry is reproducing it. Just because a garment worker may be choosing the job and not being owned and chained by someone as seen in chattel slavery, is it really a choice if all you were given was something bad or something worse? Someone choosing to work a difficult, draining job just to barely survive was not so much a choice of freedom, rather the illusion of choice within an oppressive system. No one would choose to do this work under these conditions unless the alternative was practically death by starvation. Once again, I say, just because you can't see the chains doesn't mean they're not there. What we're seeing in today's world of corporate production is not as far away from slavery as we would like it to believe. And it's not just fast fashion. In one of my previous videos, I discussed the use of unregulated migrant labor in the luxury handbag industry in Italy. An investigative journalist found that luxury brands under conglomerate LVMH were subcontracting work to independent factories that were using short-term work contracts for Senegalese migrants. Under these contracts, workers had no benefits or protections, and while on the job, they worked long hours and weren't provided safety equipment. The journalist talked to several workers who experienced extreme injuries on the job, and some who received a brutal beating at the end of their contract instead of getting paid. Check out that video for more on that story here. My point in saying all this is that if we were to draw parallels, I would say that modern day corporations and their conglomerate owners are the equivalent of the joint stock corporations back then and their colonial empires. All of them concerned with the pursuit of profit and power and willing to engage in violence to get it. In today's world, this manifests as a slow violence, invisible to the eyes of general society, but accumulating so much damage over time. The damage of fast fashion's crimes against humanity is not felt quite yet by some parts of the world. This is why we still see clothing hauls and the normalization of buying way more clothes than one person would ever need. This is why we have made overconsumption aspirational, why we equate our own worth and success to our capacity for consumption, aka the I just want to get rich people, and you ask them why, and their answer is, so I can buy whatever I want, obviously. That has become a very normal and logical life philosophy in our consumerist society. It's become very normal to have your main life goal be increasing your capacity for consumption. increasing your access to material goods in the form of cars, clothes, and other frivolous things. But that's actually not normal. It's not normal to constantly be shopping for new clothes. And it's not normal to buy the newest iPhone every year when it comes out, when your current iPhone is working just fine. It's not normal to have multiple cars that you don't drive. And it's not normal to have a huge, expensive home as a single person or even as a small family. What we're seeing in today's profit-centered society is the same violence that fueled colonization and slavery hundreds of years ago. You know how sometimes you wonder, how were all those people back then okay with subjugating other populations in such cruel ways? Like, how were people okay with slavery? How did people normalize such violence? Well, I think it's all about how it's marketed. The masses can be convinced to be okay with anything if it's marketed the right way. Back then, it was marketed as exciting ventures into the new world, access to new lands and resources that can make us wealthy. It was marketed as blessings from God in the form of abundant, fertile land, and people to work the land for us for free. In this era of mass consumerism and capitalism, corporations are getting away with exploitation and essentially modern day slavery by marketing the idea that consumption will bring you joy and make you feel fulfilled. So buy more, buy more, buy more. They market cute trendy styles and new savvy updates, constantly changing beauty trends and household must-haves, all to get you to be okay, mostly subconsciously, with the cruel subjugation of other populations. If you wonder what stance you would have taken against slavery and oppression back then, all you have to do is look at your actions today. Will you be a part of the masses lulled by consumerism into a state of apathy, or will you wake up and refuse to be a part of this violence? So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear them. If you enjoyed, hit the subscribe button and turn on your post notifications so you can be notified every time I upload. I also have an Instagram account called @FightBigFashion where I make infographics and I share resources all about the dark side of fast fashion and consumerism. I will see you guys in the next video. Ciao!